time is already upon us, of course, to talk about the final of the three cars in GT7 1.52, and this one, at least for me, was definitely an underwhelming one. Not only in terms of it being added to the game, it's totally unsurprising, obviously, to add another GTR variant, especially given that this is the swan song, essentially, of the R35, but more so because of how it actually performs, or at least in mildly tuned to standard form, because when I talked about this car initially, in my first impressions and thoughts of 1.52, I of course mentioned the fact that I dropped the weight. I also changed the aero a little bit, but nothing too crazy. Still, dropping it from the standard 1760 kilo curb weight down to more like 1200, you would think would make a pretty massive difference in a car that's already got a pretty healthy amount of power. It's not earth-shattering by GTR standards, 562, so it's no Nismo, but still, that's not exactly lacking. And again, a 1200 kilo car, even with 560 horses, well, that's the recipe to be an absolute beast. It should be at least on par with some race cars, in fact, in terms of lap time, even on sports tyres, and of course with all-wheel drive and all the kind of clever tech that a GTR has put into it, especially given that being a 2024 model year GTR no less, the whole point of which is kind of to send off the model before we move forward. Well, the GTR's been around since 2007, so at this point you'd expect it to be pretty damn incredible. And yet, it's almost like they forgot to update the car's physics or something, because when you drop the weight it makes barely any difference to how it actually handles, despite the fact that it's literally half a ton lighter, which is an insane amount to drop in any car, let alone something with already that kind of power and performance, and yet the brakes feel pretty horrendous. The cornering, at least in standard form, is actually quite bad. It's not just underwhelming, it's actively bad. It's really heavy through corners. It almost feels, to be honest, like some of the Vision GT cars, which almost feel more like front-wheel drive chassis, but in a bad way. In fact, I think one of the ways that I might describe this is it's kind of like driving a GTR Nismo LM race car, which a lot of people really hate with that front-wheel drive chassis. Now, for me, I like that one because it's different, it's oddball, and here's the crucial thing, it's actually quick. If you can master the GTR LM, it is a genuinely, insanely quick car in a straight line. You just have to learn how to use it through the corners. This one doesn't really feel worth the effort, at least in standard form. Now, I'm happy to say this is definitely one of those cars where its personality changes if you really pour cash into it. That's kind of the problem though. You shouldn't need to. It's a GTR. And I've driven a early model GTR in real life, a tuned by Litchfield 850 horsepower version. I also drove the facelift version, also Litchfield tuned to 650, and both of them were fantastic to drive. They weren't difficult, they weren't heavy, they certainly didn't have bad brakes, and they were ridiculously fast. In other words, everything you'd expect a GTR to be. This does not feel like those at all. In fact, if those cars felt like this one, I'd have probably died because I would have crashed the damn thing, because this is not very impressive to drive at all. The fact that the car gets better when you do fully build it though is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, yes, it is cool that you can tune it to over 1,000 horsepower with the standard engine. Of course it's going to be quick, and I mean, you'd sure as hell hope it's going to be quicker with 1,000 horsepower now in a 1,200 kilo car with all-wheel drive as well. You shouldn't have to do that much to it, because the GTR was already brilliant, and it wouldn't have made a name for itself if it was like this to drive to begin with. It's almost like the car has ended up being so ridiculously bloated with unnecessary size and tech that it's ended up doing exactly the opposite to what the Porsche 911 has done in the same kind of time period. Because again, to go back to beards and cars, I drove a 997 generation Carrera, which is to this day one of my favourite handling cars I've ever driven, and part of the reason why is because it still feels very compact, like an old school 911. It feels very analog, even with the advancements in tech that Porsche put into the car. The newer one, which I've driven, which is a 991 generation, more like the GT3 RS which we have in the game, the one that I drove was a Targa 4S, so of course not as quick as that, but it had gotten much bigger, much more tech heavy, and for every bit as brilliant as it was, it didn't feel like the same kind of car anymore. That feels to me exactly what's happened here, except with the Porsche, it has made it a faster car. You could dislike it for being more tech heavy or bigger or more bloated, but at the end of the day you can't really argue with the lap times if all you're looking for is performance. The GT3 RS is just undeniably a very, very quick car. The GTR, although quick, just doesn't really feel that quick. It's a very strange occurrence because This honestly handles more like what I'd expect something like a modern day Nissan Stager to feel like. And I like the Stager, but what I mean by that is it feels like it handles and has the weight and the girth and the wallowiness of something like a GTR wagon rather than a normal GTR. And on that slight tangent, well, really a massive tangent, but I really do think that's kind of a missed opportunity, not making a modern day Nissan Stager of some kind to rival the Audi RS6. The GTR and the Audi RS6 already have a lot in common anyway, but that's by the by. For now, this is a car where if you do pour the cash into it, so 200 grand to buy the thing, then however many couple hundred grand depending on what things you do or don't want to buy, of course, then it is going to be a lot better. And as you can see here, you can do an interesting comparison because the one that I'm driving here in the video, in that fully built form, albeit on sports tyres rather than racing tyres, compare that to the video which I used, or the footage that I used, in my 1.52 review. That one only had the weight loss and aero. So they look pretty much the same, but there's a colossal difference in power, almost twice as much, and you can see the difference on the track. It's so much more nimble, of course way quicker in a straight line, and it is far, far better to drive. And that is one thing which is actually really good about this car, because completely unintentionally, fully built, over 1,000 horses, 1,200 kilos, etc, etc, as long as you leave it on sports hards, this is literally right under 700 points. So although it's probably not going to be the most economical of things to drive around, Le Mans or whatever on the endurance event, if you're just looking for 700 point performance rather than fuel economy, this thing is properly quick then, especially in a straight line, and of course off the line as well. For me, it's very much a mixed bag. As you can tell, I want to like the car. I already have a lot of respect for the R35, and for any who might think, maybe you're new to the channel, that it sounds like I'm a bit of a hater, I'm really not. In fact, I will commonly call the R35, especially in that original 2007 form, one of the most influential and one of the most important performance cars of all time, not just the modern era, because it reinvented what was capable on a £60,000 budget. This one just doesn't feel like it has any of that anymore. It feels bigger, heavier, overpriced, and for a car which is almost 2 decades on, it just doesn't feel like it's changed in 2 decades worth of advancement. And that's kind of a shame. But ultimately it still has its fans. Of course there are people who love the car, and I would say that my closing thoughts on this particular R35 are it's only worth buying if you specifically want a GTR that has over 1,000 horses on the standard engine, or if you just want one that looks a bit different. In terms of everything else, you're better off sticking with an existing GTR, especially if you drop a Bugatti Chiron engine into one of them, which I'm sure will come down the line for this one as well at some point. So that's it for my thoughts on this one, and of course for all of the cars now in GT7 1.52. Stick around for more Gran Turismo content, and of course plenty of other content in older Gran Turismo games and various other games as well, both here on the main videos and of course in the members section as well. But for now, thanks for watching.